Go Create. We redefine success in leadership, business, and ministry. This is your host, Tim Winders. If you hear anything that educates you or inspires you, and I'm sure that you will, please subscribe and share Seek, Go Create with others. This is how we spread the message, people like you sharing what we do. We appreciate that, and we thank you for that. Thank you for listening in. I'm going to go ahead and jump in to introduce our guest because I've been excited about this for some time, and I didn't realize even how excited I was until I was doing some additional preparation yesterday. And I'll share as we get going how timely this is for myself, my wife, and our family in just a moment. So we have Mitzi Perdue as our guest, and she is the daughter of one family business, Titan. The father founded the Sheraton hotel chain. Yes, that's one. And the widow of another. Her late husband was the family business poultry magnate, Frank Perdue. And she's also a businesswoman. We're going to have discussions about that. But one of the fascinating things about that we're going to listen in on is her ability to discuss family history, family legacy, and what we can all do. And then we're just going to tap in on a lot of the wisdom that she has. She's also an author. We'll discuss some of the books she's done. But Mitzi, welcome to Seek, Go Create.
What a total joy to be here with you. And I just love the premise of, the title says lots of things that I just endorse and love. So I'm so glad to be here.
Excellent. All right, Mitzi, my first question I like to ask guests. I've done the bio, and there's a lot more I could have read. There's so much on your bio, but what I really love to do is to just pretend that we bump into each other, we're out somewhere or whatever we could do in the world we're in today. And I ask the question, Mitzi, what do you do? If someone asks you that, how do you respond?
All right. What I do today is, speaking of Seek, Go Create, I'm very involved in combating human trafficking, and I have some ways to do it that help other anti-trafficking organizations. I help raise funds for them, and I help raise awareness of the whole issue. But in addition to that, I also speak about family businesses, and I love to tell stories of how my late father built the Sheraton Hotel Corporation from no employees to 20,000 at the time of his death. And I also like to tell about how my late husband, Frank Perdue, my hero, how he had a remarkably similar story to my late father. He started with no employees, and at the time of his death, he also employed 20,000 people. So I love to share how they did it. And then the final thing about me, if anybody wants to know how I became what I am today, which is a writer, a broadcaster, a communicator, a speaker.
Wow, excellent. Okay, so there's so much there. I had questions written down, but you said something that kind of altered my next question, I guess.
Yay.
Because what I really want to do is, as someone who's engaging with you, other than email for the first time, I want to go ahead and hear a few of those stories and jump right into that, because I think it's going to allow for us to do layers with our follow-up that we do. So and I know it's probably not a few moments story, but tell a little bit of the history of both of those family legacies. You can start with, Henderson, because it fascinates me. I love hearing, I'm a business guy, man of faith,
Yay.
Also leadership guy. So I love hearing these things, and I believe our audience will too. So let's start with the Henderson family. Give us overview, the story, and then I'll possibly follow up, and then maybe we'll move to the Perdues and go from there. This is going to be fascinating.
Oh, I'd love that. Well, my late father and my uncles founded the Sheraton Hotel Company or Corporation back in the 1930s. And that was a time when it was the time of the Great Depression. There was 25% unemployment. And that meant sort of a little bit like today with COVID-19. that people weren't going to hotels, and the whole hotel industry was just, in the most dire straits, and nobody would buy any hotels. So a hotel that was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy would probably find no buyers. My father, on the other hand, he is president as well as co-founder. He figured out some ways of making a hotel be financially stable and strong, and so successful that after he bought the first hotel and it did well, he had enough money to buy 2 more hotels. And after that, he bought 4 hotels. And at the end of his life, he had 400 hotels. And by the way, we did sell the company on his death. But I grew up, it was really kind of cool. I got to grow up as a hotel heiress, and trust me, that can be really fun. However, I want to mention something, a really important part of the story. I'd love to share how he did it, because I was forever asking him how he did it. But I'd also like to share a little bit about what his theories were on child rearing, because I think that's as important today as it was back then. Which one of those should I go for? How he did it, or
You know what?
parenting theories?
Let's do the how, because I want to have some family discussion in a moment. So let's do the how of business, and then we'll move to that. How about that?
Okay, father, yeah, as a little girl, I was forever asking Daddy how he did it, because it was just so clear to me that this guy was really successful. I went to public schools as well as private schools, and I was really aware that the house that I lived in was very different from the houses of my classmates and so forth. So I knew he was a success, and I'm asking him, how did you do it? He had several answers, but here's one of them. He told me that the success of the company was the people who worked for the company at every level. And that brings up the question, well, how did you inspire people to, stay with you for life and be willing to go to the extra mile continuously? Because that's what it took to build a big company. You have to be the kind of leader that people want to follow, and that they're enthusiastic about coming to work, and that they will go the extra mile. So I was asking him, how do you get that kind of engagement? And he told me a story, which I'll now share with you. He said that whenever he'd take over a hotel, and we're talking, during the Great Depression, he said the first thing that he'd do when he had bought a hotel would be he'd invite all the employees, and that there can easily be 400, 500, 600 employees, and invite them all to come into the hotel ballroom, and he'd address them, as the new owner. But he told me that he knew ahead of time that every person in his audience was probably half scared to death, because it's typical when a hotel's on the edge of bankruptcy for the new owners to get rid of the dead wood, to bring in their own team and take care of their cousins and uncles and nephews. So everybody in the audience is worrying about, is today the day I get fired? Well, Father knew that, and he also knew that they probably weren't going to really absorb a word he said until he took care of that great big looming question in the minds of his audience. So the first words out of his mouth were, I want every one of you to keep your job. And I have a reason for wanting you to keep your job. I know that you know your job better than anybody else on the planet. And my job is to give you the resources and the encouragement to show the world just how good you are. And you're going to see, as a team, as we all work together, we're going to turn this hotel around. And you'll see in a couple of months, it's going to be the most successful, the most financially sound, the most popular hotel in the city. And on top of that, as a team, these are dark times, but we're going to show the whole city that things can turn around and get better. Imagine how an employee would feel, walking in there thinking, oh my gosh, today's the day I'll be fired, to, hey, this guy believes in me, and that we're a team, and that we're going to be an inspiration to the whole rest of the city. Cool?
Yeah, that's very cool, because what it does too is it eliminates fear as much as can be eliminated. And then it instills hope at a time that probably many people can relate to right now, where things seem somewhat hopeless. There's a lot of lack of hope, and we don't see that in a lot of leaders. That's something that we don't see, definitely from a political standpoint, not to get into all of that, but we don't see a lot of people that cast that we are going to do all that we can to make sure that you're taken care of. And we're going to do all we can to make sure that the organization is moving forward and succeeding, because both those go together. So that's beautiful, Mitzi. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, but I've got to mention that there's a PS to it, and then there's a PP to it.
Yes, keep going.
Okay, the PS to the story is, I asked Father, why did you just kind of give it away, saying that they could keep their job no matter what? Why not make them earn it? And he said, that's not the best approach. Instead, he said, a leader's job is to give people a better vision of themselves. And so he wanted it such that, well, to take an example, that the chambermaid who's making beds, or the bartender who's pouring drinks, that they're just not making beds or pouring drinks. No, they're a team that's going to show the whole city how good things can be. And, that I think you're going to be much more eager to come to work if you've got a better vision of yourself, that you're not making beds, you're not pouring drinks, you're not lugging suitcases around. No, you're doing something inspirational. So, but I haven't gotten to the PS to the story yet.
Okay.
The PS is, he told me, remember there's a PPS, but he told me that the next day, the employees would get to see something that they probably never expected to see, which is, if a hotel is really going downhill, it's probably got stains in the carpets and frayed curtains. But he said he would, this part's expected, he would have decorators and plumbers and electricians and just people coming to spruce up the hotel. But he said what the workers would not expect is that in every single case, the first places that he would spruce up would be areas that the paying public would never see. They would be like the employee dining room, let's say the showers, the locker rooms, maybe the corridors, just stuff that the public would never see, but the workers would see. And he said, that goes along with demonstrating to the employees how important they were to him, that he would spend the first money in every single case, not on the areas that the public would see, but on the areas that the employees would feel. And Father's opinion was that since the employees were the most important resource, that it was just critically important to send the signal to them how much he valued them.
Wow, that's beautiful. And what a great example of just honoring people. And
well, look how far it took him. 400 hotels, 20,000 employees at the time of his death. And he was famous for that. If you started working with him, you stayed with him for life. And he could never have grown the hotels like he did if people weren't working for something, a better vision. And I told you there was a PS, and if you're ready for the PPS, which I love, and again, it's something that so applies to today. And here it is. Again, I'm a little girl asking him how he did it. And I said, how come you just let people have their jobs rather than earning it in some way? Maybe threatening them, maybe bribing them in one way or another, getting the maximum performance from them. I don't think I used those terms as a little girl, but it is what I was trying to get at. And his answer, which I recommend to absolutely everybody today because it still counts, he said that in his world, there were 3 ways to get people to do what you want. He said the first one, and again, this is how he looked at the world. The first one was, he told me, I could have stood up in front of 700 employees and I could have told them, shape up or you're fired. And he said, you can probably get people to shape up, but they'll do it grudgingly. They'll do the absolute minimum that they can get by with and keep their jobs. He said that form of getting people to do what you want is intimidation. he said, it's just, how about almost universally wrong, because you're not going to get the best of people by irritating them and making them mad at you and making them afraid of you. He said, in his world, that was just a lousy approach. He said, the second way to get people to do what you want is, he said, I could have stood up there in front of them and I could have said, do a great job and there's a bonus in it for you. Do a super job and there's a raise in it for you. But he said, that's too transactional, that people would work for the reward rather than the bigger picture, which is we're a team making the whole place great. So he didn't like intimidation. And one of the reasons is, he said, you have to keep upping the ante. Just psychologically, somebody gets used to their raise very fast, or they get used to their bonus very fast. It's no longer deeply motivating. So I think I mentioned that there were 3 ways of getting people to do what you want. Intimidation, bad. Bribery, not good. So what was left? And he said inspiration. He said that when people are working for something bigger than themselves, they will go the extra mile. They'll be excited to come to work. Their job becomes deeply meaningful to them. And that, in his view, was the secret of what made Sheraton grow and be a spectacular success. Because, he didn't say this, but this is me observing, because of the way he treated people.
Wow, those are excellent lessons just right there. And then you brought up the aspect of family and children and rearing children. I think what I'd like to do now, though, because we've got some business momentum here, I would like to pause that. I made notes here. I've been taking notes while we're going along, because I want to have a deeper discussion about family related to a lot of things. So at this time, could we jump over to that Perdue line and maybe pull, I'm sure you mentioned there's some things that we could glean from that also, maybe some similar items. So let's stay in that business realm if we can. And then we're going to, good. I thought you might be. And so Mitzi, if you could, what are some lessons we could all learn from the way that line of your legacy, your family that you've obviously married into that one, but still you're a part of that. What can we learn from what he did and that business that he created?
Well, in separate ways, both men went to enormous effort to make the people who worked with them feel important. And there was one, people often ask me, were you part of running Perdue Farms? And the answer is absolutely not, except in one teeny tiny way, which I think was very important. And that is, when Frank and I first got married, it occurred to me that it would be a really good idea, which he didn't think at all at the beginning, that it would be a really good idea to entertain every single person who worked for the company. And it was 16,000 people at that point. And so I suggested it to Frank, and his immediate reaction was, no, that's totally impractical. 16,000 people, no. And I said, as if I hadn't realized that he had said no, I said, let's have them 100 at a time. No, that's way too many. And then I said, I bet we could put it together in 6 weeks, this being August. I bet by the end of September, we could start. No, that's way too soon. And my reason for thinking that entertaining everybody in our home for dinner was a great idea was I grew up in the hospitality industry, and making people feel important is just, how I was brought up. Well, Frank initially totally resisted the idea, but as we kept discussing it, kind of going round and round, I could tell that he was changing from, what planet did she set down from, to, maybe there's something to it, to finally, I like it. And 6 weeks later, we did begin entertaining people in groups of 100, and would have people who knew each other, like would have the veterinarians or the accountants or the sanitation people. We would have, and would have them in groups that knew each other, because I could imagine that it might be intimidating to have dinner at the big boss's house. But we set up our living room with a great big giant long buffet table. And in case you're wondering, yeah, we did serve chicken. But one of the coolest things about this was Frank would wait on his employees. I mean, he'd stand behind the buffet table and serve his employees. And isn't that just the coolest thing, that a Fortune 500 size company, the head of it, waits on his employees? And by the way, I should mention that the reason that he went along with my wacko crazy idea of entertaining 16,000 people over the years was, I know, or at least I learned later, that a big thing that motivated Frank was showing people that they're important. And this, the idea of entertaining every single person in our house fit in with his goal of making people feel important. And at these parties, there would be 100 people, and towards the end of the evening, he'd stand up in front of everybody and he'd tell them what was going on in the company. And imagine that you're a sanitation worker or a cybersecurity person or whoever, and you hear the head of the company telling you, the great things or the problems or the things that we're worried about or what we're going to do about it. If you're part of a very large company, a Fortune 500 size company, and you get to hear from the boss's mouth exactly, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think your sense of engagement and ownership just increases exponentially. And then at the end of every evening, he'd use different words each time, but the last words he'd say would be some version of, I know that the company wouldn't be what it is today without you, and I'm grateful. Thank you. And, again, what must it mean? Actually, I can answer the question that I'm going to ask. What does it mean to somebody to be thanked by the head of the company and entertained in his home? And here's what I know. There were many funerals that I would attend, because we, as a family business, we attend funerals, where the next of kin would tell me that one of the most meaningful and moving events in the deceased's life was being invited to Frank's home for dinner and thanked.
Wow, that's powerful. And so I'm guessing that took quite a long time to implement and do that, if you're doing it in groups of 100 with 16,000 people,
6
right?
weeks.
Wow. So you
6
did it
weeks.
all. So y'all were,
Well,
so
no,
y'all,
we would have there was 6 weeks between when I told Frank that I thought this would be a really good idea to
yeah.
actually implementing it. And it took 6 weeks before we started. And that meant, reconfiguring a kitchen and having warming ovens and and even having knives, forks, and plates. But it was always a buffet thing.
Sure.
But we did get it started in 6 weeks. And then pretty much 3 times a month would have groups of people, 100, maybe 150 if it was a large department. But it was just so cool, because it was a chance for him to interact with people and for them to interact with him. And it just really worked. And it was infinitely satisfying to me, because, well, there's a quote that Frank loved, but I believe in with all my heart. And of the things that I'm going to say today, this may be one of the most useful to people. It's a quote from Henry James, came from like 120 years ago. He was a psychiatrist, and he said, the deepest principle of human nature is the craving for appreciation. And this was a way to show people, hey, we really appreciate you. You're important enough to us that we invite you to our home for dinner.
Yeah, and pay expenses and invite into your home, which there's a principle of inviting people in. There's a principle of breaking bread together. I am very excited to hear that y'all serve chicken. I would have been I would have had to follow up that question and said, so what'd y'all serve? What'd you have to eat? So anyway.
Well, I'll tell you a little behind the scenes story of why it was chicken. First of all, Frank loved chicken.
I would
I
hope
would
so.
cook every night, and I would cook every night, and I'd know that I would have a happy husband if I had chicken, fish, or pasta. If I served anything else, he was a good sport, but he wasn't going to rave over it. So somewhere after the first year, I never served anything but that. But there's another part to the story, which is we never had these catered. We did have the cafeteria prepare the food, the Purdue, the local plant cafeteria. And this is something, it's not important, but it makes me happy. And it's this, the chef at the cafeteria absolutely loved these parties, and I think loved me because of it. He got to try out all sorts of fancy chicken recipes that didn't belong in the cafeteria, but that would belong in dinner at night. So, I mean, he'd tell me over and over again that he just loved cooking for these buffet parties.
So excellent. So you also even had the food preparation people that were able to kind of spread their wings and have fun with the situation also. Mitzi, I think the first few minutes here have been incredibly valuable to anyone running an organization or interacting with people. And I've taken a lot of notes, but I'm going to shift just a little bit here. Not entirely, because I think it still relates to, the family history, the legacy. And I want to give just a little background because I'm almost going to allow you to give me some advice, because what I want to share is
I like nothing better than telling people.
Good.
I was going to say, I like nothing better than telling people what to do.
Yes. And so, well, I'm a business coach. I work with businesses and organizations and also some ministries in working with the leadership teams, helping to be as much as they can be and achieve and accomplish. And currently I am working with one, two, maybe the third one. And then also my wife and I are personally working on establishing some, we'll call it legacy type items. One client, and I don't work with them specifically in this, I work with their business and organization, but they're setting up a family office.
Yay.
One is a younger family with younger children, but he's starting to think, what is his company? We're trying to build a company for a possible exit or a sale or offering, so that he could then structure some things. And just in the last week, Mitzi, my wife and I have sat down and we've begun working on things such as the guiding principles of our family, such as what are our core values, such as what do we want to see 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. We've just had our first grandchild. And so, yeah, which is kind of a game changer. You start thinking differently about things. But I will say this, and I say it as a preface to the question, all of those are probably, like many of our listeners, first generation attempting to establish something that lasts longer than they do. So with that premise, give some initial thoughts and advice, and then I'm probably going to dig and ask some more questions, because you've been able to see this from two lineages, from two heritages that are phenomenal. And I would love personally to glean from that. And I believe our listener would too.
Okay, I feel that on the question of establishing a legacy, it's never too early and it's never too late. And I adore the idea of codifying the values that you have. Frank Perdue did that, and I recommend this to everybody. He did this when he was 80, but I think, do it when you're 30. He knew he was going to give his family material goods, money, but he felt that doesn't necessarily lead to happiness. And he wanted his kids to be happy. And he wanted those who came after him to be happy. And he felt that the best way to do that was to have the highest values. And so he wrote what he called an ethical will. Actually, we wrote it together. I'll tell you how we did it in case anybody wants to do something similar. We dedicated 3 days, sort of total immersion into figuring out what values will make a person happy. And we came up actually with like 50. We were just brainstorming, trying to get the best. But we both figured out that nobody's going to remember 50, that we should narrow it down to 10. And to this day, I mean, that was, good Lord, that was 20 years ago. to this day, his ethical will is still, frequently quoted by family members. Like the first one in this ethical will, 10 things to do if you want a happy life. The first one was be honest. Second one was be somebody who's worthy of trust. Another one was, if you want to be happy, think what you can do for somebody else. If you want to be miserable, think what's owed to you. And others were, hard work is satisfying and fulfilling. But he also said, belong to something bigger than yourself, possibly your church, but it could also be, I don't know, maybe a political club, maybe something environmental, maybe a charity. But he felt that to really be happy, you had to have something outside yourself that you give yourself to. And how neat that he thought of that. But then I will also mention that he did a great many other things. Like here's one of the things that he did that I admired no end. By the time, and I was a part of it, so of course I like it. I'm a big believer in family newsletters. And by family newsletters, I mean the kind of thing, it doesn't tell trivial stuff. How about you interview the older members of the family? What was like when you were growing up? What were your biggest challenges? And the idea is that the more you know about your family, the more you sort of have a roadmap of how we do things. Basically, it's instilling a culture. And a culture, I'm going to define culture. Culture is, in its simplest form, the way we do things, without even thinking about it. And the families that leave a culture to accident are very often the families that don't survive, because the cultures that come about by accident, and every family has a culture, the way we do things, but if it's left to accident, they're going to get a whole lot of influences from the outside that probably aren't going to help the family to continue across the generations. And I'll tell you, just right off the bat, one of the values that Frank was very big on instilling is be philanthropic. That, it gets back to, if you want to be happy, think what you can do for somebody else. He was a deep believer that a family gets its identity, not just by the money that it brings in, but the good that it does in the community. And I've been monologuing for too long.
No,
Ask me questions.
That's good. And one of the things that we see, and I know you've spoken on this and have expertise in this, is what happens in most families. I do strategic growth and planning in businesses and organizations all the time. But the odd thing about it, Mitzi, is that very few people do that in a family situation. And as I've read some of the things you've done and studied and all, it is very obvious that there's some, I'll use a word that's thrown around today, intentionality, very intentional, focused planning. Just a newsletter, for example. There's probably some people going, well, I've got a newsletter for my local club. I've got a newsletter for my information or my, my business that's related, but I never thought of it for my family. So what you probably just said was extremely practical, but also extremely different. So,
well,
anyway.
actually, it goes even farther than that, because so many of the family stories are going to get lost unless somebody interviews the older people and asks them questions about it. And these are like roadmaps for living. They instill the culture. But somewhere around maybe 15 years ago, since I study persuasion, and I also study how cultures are formed, everything that I've studied sort of converges on the idea of, if you want to instill a culture, get kids while they're young. And, I'd already been writing a newsletter for probably 12 years or so, the kind where I would ask Frank ethical questions or moral questions or financial questions. And I'd ask the older people or the older generations questions that would be meaningful and like guideposts for living. But then it occurred to me, why don't I write a kids newsletter? For aimed at kids age 4 to 12. And I've been doing it. Well, there's a hiatus now because there aren't any kids exactly the right age for it, but for probably 12 years. And I do intend to, when the fifth generation is old enough to want it, I intend to revive it. But here's something that I just so recommend for everybody. I think this counts by the time you're second or third generation. I would have maybe 4 times a year a newsletter that was written in very simple language, like very big type, short sentences, and with the understanding that in the case of the 4-year-old, their grown-up would be reading it to them. But it would tell stories about that would have like morals to them, almost parables, except they would be based on family history. And to give you a very specific example, like a somewhat recent one, the Perdue family and the Hendersons too, for that matter, we're very big on being frugal. We don't want family members to get their identity by spending lots of money on stuff. We want them to get their identity through service. Well, part of being frugal, this is a newsletter that I wrote about it. The great-grandmother, Mummy Dew, used to make biscuits for the whole family, would get together at Thanksgiving and a feature would be Mummy Dew's biscuits. Mummy Dew, and this is a story I'm telling the grandkids who never met her, she used to, whip up the batter for biscuits, and then you've got a baking sheet and should cover the baking sheet with aluminum foil, bake the biscuits, remove the biscuits, scrape off the crumbs, and then wash the aluminum foil with soap and water and reuse it. And the lesson there is that we're a frugal family, we're an environmental family, we don't waste, we just don't like waste. So that they're getting a message that is, as you mentioned, the word that I like so much is a very intentional message that we are a frugal family, but that's not the end of it. Every newsletter would be accompanied by a treasure chest. I'm looking to see if I've got one within reach. Well, it would be a treasure chest about the size of a shoebox. And inside it would be gifts for the kids so that they'd really be looking forward to the newsletter because kids like gifts. And each one would carry out the theme of whatever that newsletter was about. So the one with Mummy Dew and her biscuits, it would have in a baggie, it would have the ingredients for her biscuit. You just add water, have aluminum foil, and it would also have a kid's chef hat and a chef's smock. And the kids would make the biscuits and get to eat them afterwards, but they'd also carry out the idea of after they'd made the biscuits, they'd wash the aluminum foil and fold it up so it could be used again. And they and their grown-up would talk about, we're a frugal family, we get our identity, recycling is just really important and not wasting. And so it's just a very intentional way of teaching kids who they are and where they came from.
Wow,
and by the way, this is part of a bigger story, which is there's a woman that I just totally recommend to absolutely everybody that they learn about at Emory University. There's this woman named Robin Fivish, and she studies what makes a family high functioning. And by high functioning, it means the family enjoys being together, the kids don't get in trouble with the law, they do well in school. In general, they're physically and mentally healthy. They're able to hold down jobs when they're grown up. What makes a family high functioning in that sense? And she says, I find this amazing, but I've seen her research and I totally believe it and endorse it. She said, the more family members know their family stories, the more high functioning the whole family is. It gives something that makes your personality just reflect on and be I think it's even the wiring of the brain. You know who you are and where you came from and how we do things. And knowing those things are just extremely healthy for a family. And I can add something else that's of great value. And that is the families, and this is quoting Robin Fivish's research, the families that have more than 5 meals together in the course of a week. That's very protective against such things as substance abuse or getting in trouble with the law. If you compare the families where they have 5 or more meals together in the course of a week versus those that have 1 or none, I can't guarantee that having 5 meals is going to make sure that your kid doesn't have drug abuse problems, but you sure increase your odds phenomenally. So, intentionally, even if it's, I know that it's hard. Maybe, I don't know, maybe money's so tight that you're holding 2 jobs or who knows what, that it can be a real drag and a real inconvenience to make sure that you have meals together. But what's more important? At the end of your days, what's more important than your intimate relations? Or to quote Jackie Onassis, she said, if your kids turn out right, nothing else matters. And she also said, if your kids turn out wrong, nothing else matters. So when I say have 5 meals together in the course of a week, I'm not ignoring that that's a big ask, but the rewards are infinite.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember growing up. I grew up outside of Atlanta, where Emory University is there, and we would have been, I guess, middle class, lower middle. My father worked in education. My mother did also, and it was very interesting. We had every meal together in the evening
Uh,
up until the time I entered high school, and then my schedule. I was the oldest. I started having a lot going on. And the second thing that changed things was when a Domino's pizza opened up locally in our area, we started eating much more pizzas. So I don't know what that says about me, but that's an interesting sidebar. You did bring up one thing that I do want to go a little bit deeper on. You brought up the financial aspect. You brought up the fact that some people money could be tight and they may not be able to do things. But I also know that an abundance of money can cause challenges at times for people. It really does create a lot in us as humans. I would love to hear your perspective, because I know that there are people that may be listening that might be going, well, we may not be able to do a lot of those things because we don't have that type of financial legacy. I disagree with that. We are actually putting in place some basic things that we believe can continue, whether there's financial abundance or whatever there. But also
but
know
the
that,
families,
yeah,
I'm
but
sorry
what,
for interrupting, excuse me, that Mitzi.
yeah, go. Because, let me mention one more thing and then I'll let you go for a while. Because we have seen in society, families with an abundance have many challenges. So speak to both sides of that as best you can, because I know that could be bouncing around in people's heads.
Perfect. And to the extent that we can respond to what's bouncing around in people's heads, that's what I want to do. I'm here to try to share information. I'm 79 years old, and at this age, the most important thing to me is to be useful to other people. So let's address first the family where, maybe dad's lost a job, maybe mom is underemployed. And so money isn't just floating around. And I bet that's most of Americans right now. These are really tough times. Okay, so under that circumstance, I think that family should almost put as much effort into being close and supporting each other as anybody else, because to my mind, the most important thing that at the end of your days, when you look back on your life, I don't think you're going to think how much money I made. I think you're going to think, oh, my children loved me. They turned out well. That's what's really important. And so whatever you can do to foster that, I don't think the money, I just don't think that lack of money should prevent you from having a happy, fulfilled life with your children. And by the way, I think that does mean not being their best friend when they're growing up. I think I'm a big believer in saying no. But let's go to an area that I'm a lot more familiar with, which is the families of abundance, of how about filthy, stinking rich abundance?
You said it. You said it. I didn't. That's a
Oh, no,
technical
I didn't
term,
say
right?
that. You're hallucinating again. Sorry.
I said that out loud.
Okay, but what about those families? Because like you mentioned that you're working with a family that may have a liquidity event in which they sell the company. How do you keep the kids from just screwing up their lives? And by the way, that's almost the biggest question I ever get. How do you keep the kids straight? And I'll tell you the things that I witnessed in my birth family, my family of origin, and my marital family. The my father was a captain of industry. He employed 20,000 people. He had 400 hotels, but he still took the time every Sunday after church services to have what he called family hour. And during that time, he'd instruct us on things that would be useful, like telling us how stocks and bonds work, or he'd tell us about that it's okay to spend the interest but not the principal, or how just critically important it is to be trustworthy. Or I can remember once him telling me or telling us that the greatest pleasure his money ever gave him was in giving it away. And then he'd tell us endless stories about our those who came before. Like one piece of family lore that I just treasure is we had an ancestor who in the 1890s, it was a period of bank panics. This man went bankrupt 3 different times, but every time he picked himself back up, went back to work, paid off his creditors, even though he didn't need to, and ended up being fantastically wealthy. And I love those stories of resilience that, he's smacked down, probably not his fault. I mean, if a bank fails and your money goes with it, you could be bitter the rest of your life, or you could do what our family lore said, which is pick yourself back up, pay off your debts, and move on. So Father spent a lot of time giving us preparation for life. But then other things that they did, which I would recommend to every wealthy family that exists. One of the best things that my parents did for me and my siblings was we did go to private schools because that would help getting into college. But every one of us also went to public schools when we were younger. And that's just so valuable, because if you always go to private schools, maybe you never meet people that I met. Like one of my favorites was a kid that we shared a ride to school every day. His name was Dickie Hallett. His father was a policeman, and he'd tell just these fabulous, scary, moving stories about what it's like to be the son of a policeman, or other friends. Like one of them, her father ran a dairy, and I used to help at the dairy. I'd help. It was just so cool to be aware of life that I think that is just priceless for somebody not to grow up in a complete bubble. So again, somebody who's going to, if kids are going to inherit great wealth, make them go to public school for a couple of years or more.
Yeah.
Other things, we had chores, and I can remember at age 12, something that was just amazing to me. Since I was the youngest of 5, I always had hand-me-down clothes. When my 2 sisters outgrew the clothes, I'd get them. And then one day, Mother bought me some gloves, and they weren't hand-me-downs. And it was just the most amazing thing, And I think that if I had always been given just everything I ever wanted, I think the feeling of gratitude wouldn't be there. So I recommend, to parents, make kids earn what they get. Make gifts kind of be rare and special.
Is that the philosophy of child rearing that you mentioned earlier? That are some of those principles? Is that some of those?
Yeah, I brought my kids up that way. And one went to Harvard, one went to Berkeley, and they have great jobs. So I think being a demanding parent is a good thing. I mean, something that's almost dropped out of the vocabulary of in the year 2021. I don't think we talk a whole lot about spoiling children, but when I was growing up, and we're talking the 1940s, and if you can't do math in your head, I will tell you I'm 79 years old and proud of it. But in my era, the big concern was don't spoil the children. Don't have them, muck up their lives. Give them the values that will guide them. And by the way, Frank Perdue had exactly the same attitude. I used to be just dazzled where, there was a point where between children and grandchildren and a few great-grandchildren, I think there were like 20, and he would write them long, meaningful, guiding birthday cards. He just took such a great interest in every child. He would, something that both families did that I recommend to absolutely everybody, assuming you can afford it. If you have enough money that you can endow family vacations, that's a great thing because it's a way for families to stay together after you're gone. The Hendersons, I mentioned my father started the Sheraton Hotels, but that wasn't the first family business thing that we did. The Henderson Estate Company began in 1840, 181 years ago. And we've always stayed together. And two things keep us together. One is philanthropy, and the other is we have a weekend where we get together and just enjoy each other's company and find out what everybody's been up to. And at those times, we frequently tell stories about where we came from and, kind of preach gratitude and appreciation.
Wow. Yeah, I think I heard that somewhere, and that's fascinating. So I want to ask one specific question about that, and that is how many people typically would attend that gathering now that goes back 100, and obviously they're not still alive, but how many people usually would come to that family gathering?
Typically 70 or 80, and we had our family reunion. We had our 130th reunion, because the reunions didn't start until the company was 50 years old. So our first family reunion was 1880. And this year, last year, see if I can do math in my head. I can't, I'm just not good at this. But we celebrated continuous reunions since 1880. I'm wrong, 1890 to 2020. I guess that makes 100. It was our 130th annual reunion.
Wow.
But did I answer that 70 or 80 people show up, and even virtually?
That's beautiful. Yeah, virtually in certain times that we're in. So that's phenomenal. And I think I had heard that somewhere. So go ahead.
I'm doing what you shouldn't do, and I apologize. It's terrible to interrupt people. But since you're being nice about it, I'll barrel on. I persuaded Frank to do the same thing. I told him how well it had worked for us. And the Perdue family began in business 121 years ago. I just misspoke, 101 years ago. And we're still going strong. And I think family reunions and family philanthropy are two of the biggest reasons. I hope the newsletters help too.
I think it all does. I'll mention something about that in just a little while, but the next, I think, question in my head, which might be in others' heads, everyone's dealt with family, and many times in family there is, I'll use a negative term, but people will know what it means. There's a black sheep. There's someone who doesn't quite do what the family thinks they should do. I actually listened to something, and you mentioned you had a relative that was in a cult, which that's not usually what people want. So how do you handle conflict, or the outliers, or the ones that may not be operating to the standards that the family has set? How would y'all deal with those? I'm sure you've had to deal with it in the number of years that you have.
Both families. I mean, I have a theory that how about every family has a black sheep, because, okay, this is my theory, and I'm not speaking from academic knowledge, but just from observation. I think people get their identity by being different from the others. And so I think it's a given that there will be black sheep. But as long as they're not robbing banks or whatever, I'm for huge tolerance. Like I have on my birth side, I had a relative who was in a cult. And you all, here's a comment on cults, something that was surprising to me. I always thought that cults went after people who were like low functioning, vulnerable. No, they really want the highest functioning, wealthiest person they possibly can. Enter stage right, my sister. I mean, she's just perfect. She was, college graduate, smart, dressed well, and somehow they not only got her, she climbed the ranks in the cult and she became a recruiter and a teacher. So how do you handle when somebody belongs to something that, I mean, I do think my dear father would roll over in his grave if he knew that. But how about infinite tolerance? If that's what you want to do, we love you. Please come to our family reunions, and we're not going to pick at you for beliefs that we don't share at all. And so it remained a loving family. In the Perdue family, there's also a somewhat black sheep who didn't follow the path that everybody else did. Or let's take another example, and I won't say which family there is, but one of a family member who's since gone to her great reward had the equivalent of Down syndrome. In both the cases that I'm describing, not the cult, but the other two, I recommend all the forbearance, acceptance, appreciation that you can, that we're all different and there's room for everybody. And by the way, on politics, I won't say which family it is, but we range all the way from a professor of women's studies who for a good bit of her life has been gay, to a evangelical Christian who doesn't whatsoever agree with the family member that I just described. But kind of the family rule is we focus on what unites us and not what divides us. And we celebrate the stuff that we can and the stuff that we can't. I think there's a deep understanding that an argument isn't going to change anybody's feelings or opinions. If it's a deeply held identity thing, you are wasting your breath to try to talk somebody out of it. So, whether it's sexual orientation or whatever, accept and embrace, and just don't focus on the things that divide you. And by the way, I should sort of keep an eye on the clock because I'm getting close to.
Yes, we are. I'm watching that. So we're getting close here. I have just a couple quick things and then we'll begin wrapping up. I guess final thing I want to ask before I have a few quick questions would be the human trafficking that you mentioned earlier. To me, we had, before we recorded, we discussed some spiritual things, and as we've recorded here, we've talked about philanthropy and keeping your eyes on others as opposed to yourself. And I know that issue is one of the biggest tragedies. We have a private family foundation, and I do some work with a ministry that is doing that. They've got a group in China, and they are helping some exit the trafficking. Interesting sidebar story. You would appreciate this. As the pandemic went along, there's a ministry that has a home to bring these women in, and the pandemic changed the economic structure so much that the person that's via the ministry that we do some work with got a call from the brothel owner and said, come get these girls. I can't make any money during this pandemic. And I think it was like 14 or 18 girls that they immediately just moved right over. So there's a lot of things going on bigger picture, even though things may not look great in some parts of society. So tell us just briefly about what you have seen with trafficking, what you're obviously you have a passion for it. I looked at some things on your site, and then we'll do our wrap here in just a few moments so that you can get to your next call, and I can too. So can you do that for us?
I'd love to. I got involved with combating human trafficking a couple of years ago when I saw a video of, I don't know, maybe a dozen little girls, ages 10, 12, maybe 14. And they were about to be rescued, but I saw their faces. They didn't know they were about to be rescued. They had actually been recruited for an orgy, and this was a sting operation. And when I saw their faces just like frozen in fear, despair, terror, and I couldn't unsee it. And then I learned this lecture where I saw the video, and it does have a happy ending. They were rescued, but I learned that those little girls would be raped 10, 20 times a night, 365 days a year. And if they hadn't been rescued, their life expectancy would be less than 7 years because they were going to die of an overdose or suicide or disease or murder for organ harvesting. And then I began learning how extensive this is. There are almost 1 million children in the world who are in exactly that situation right now. There are roughly 8 million people who are being sex trafficked, and there are 40 million people, and this is according to the United Nations, actually more than 40 million, who are in slavery. I mean, they are slaves. And I thought, you know, the amount of misery involved in that. I mean, a woman who's been raped once, it's going to influence her whole life. What about somebody who's raped 10 times a night, 365 days a year? I mean, just the sheer pain, suffering, misery. I felt I had to do something. I couldn't unsee it. And I thought the one thing that I could do is, you know, I don't have the skills or the knowledge or the history to be able to help individuals. But what I could do is I could help fundraising for other organizations. And I could also help with awareness because I'm a writer by trade. I write, for most of my life, I've been a health writer and a science writer and an environmental writer. And I thought I could use those skills to help bring awareness. And so that's what I do. But I'll tell you one of the things I'm doing right now. And anybody who, if you're familiar with how to text something to somebody, I'd love for you to take out your phone and I'll tell you how to do it. If you've got a cell phone, go to the messages part and start a new message. And where it says to, this is called a short code. The short code is like a phone number, except it's shorter, 51555. So the shortcut to put in to the to part of your message is 51555. And then, this will shock you, and I hope you don't disapprove, but the message that you text, it's called the keyword, is WTF. Now, what's Mitzi Perdue doing with a word like WTF? Because I feel that that's just deeply appropriate for anything to do with human trafficking. It's the most evil thing in the world, and WTF is totally appropriate. But if you will text WTF to 51555, you'll come to my website and it will tell you, I'd love it if you'd sign up for my blog. I'd also love it if you would do something called, I'm putting on a bandana right now, and I'm turning into Rosie the Riveter, except it's Rosie the Liberator. And I'm asking everybody who wants to be part of this, and I'd love it if you'd be part of it, to take a selfie of yourself making a Rosie pose, and it doesn't have to have the banner. And if you're a guy, make it Rusty the Liberator. So Rosie the Liberator or Rusty the Liberator. And post it to your social media with hashtag win this fight. And then particularly come to texting 51555 to WTF. And I've just put it differently. Text WTF to 51555. You'll come to my website. You can upload photographs. I invite you to donate $5 to an anti-trafficking organization of your choice, including get your friends who support your anti-trafficking organization, get them to do this. And I've already distributed tens of thousands of dollars through this. So it's a really cool thing. And I would absolutely love it. If you come to my website, first of all, you can upload a photograph of yourself. You can see other really cool things that other people have done. But it's also a chance to volunteer if you'd like. And a promise that I make to you is that I will do my absolute best to use your skills at their highest and best levels so that you know that you're making a difference. And if you go to winthisfight.org, there's a place where you can contact me, and I promise to answer you, and I'd love to.
Wow, Mitzi, thank you so much for that. We will, in the notes, include that contact, and so that people can do that. Is that where you would want people to reach out to you? Is that how you want them to connect with you? I've asked that question often. Where would you want people to connect with you?
Okay, well, there's a variety of ways. The easiest, if you're familiar with texting, is to text 51555, so 51555, text WTF to that number. That's probably the easiest. Another way is just go to winthisfight.org and you'll find how to contact me there. But that's also where you'll find out how you can volunteer, how you can donate, how you can really make a difference. And my theory of life is that you're judged, or that success comes not from what you get, but by what you can give. And people ask me all the time, what can I do to combat human trafficking? I've got answers for you.
That's beautiful. I know we're pressed for time here. We are Seek, Go, Create. Mitzi, which one of those words resonates with you the most and why? And then we'll wrap up here and be finished. Which one of those words? Seek, Go,
Okay,
Create.
I'm going to go with create, because I don't know, I almost think related to our creator, that it's that creation just feels so, well, I think it's out of Matthew in the story of the talents. I think the good Lord intended us to use our talents as best we can, and creating is a way of using them.
Wow, that's excellent. Mitzi, we could speak probably for a long period of time, and I'm hopeful that this is just a first connection. Thank you so much for being on our show. I appreciate it so much. If you're listening in and you would like to continue this conversation, just jump down into our socials. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. You could continue the conversation. You could also find us at seekgocreate.com. Until the next episode, thank you so much for listening in, and continue being all that you were created to be.